Toby. Hello, Angela. We're glad to have you here with us. We have most of our class here today. We're missing two that are not well today, Rose and Caitlin Holloway, but most of us are here. I hope you are well as well. So we're going to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday with the lecture for chapter 15 on the miracle. I'm not going to read through this again. You know that he had the disciples tell people to sit down, and then they distributed the food, and then when everybody had eaten and had their full, 12 baskets were then of leftovers were brought back to Jesus. So that's the basic story. And here's what we've already talked about. We learn that this miracle reveals Christ's sovereignty, that he is sovereign. He is sovereign over nature. He created food out of, created more food out of a little bit of food. So it is a miracle of creation. It reveals Christ's sovereignty. We also learned that it requires man's obedience, that the disciples did as Jesus told. I told my children this all the time when they were little, and I've told you before, it goes well when you obey. If you're not obeying God, if you're not obeying your parents, it's probably not going well for you right now. Try it. Try obeying, and you'll see that blessing comes with obedience. And then the third one is this. It shows God's orderliness. Now, that may be true, but like Christ's manliness, it's just not the point. It is an orderly miracle, and I was raised a Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians do everything, quote unquote, decently and in order. I believe we serve a God of order. I just don't think it's the most important part of this story. But this is a very important part of it. It reveals Christ's omnipotence. He is all-powerful. This is showing that he is God. These were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. And his power in this miracle shows his omnipotence. He takes a small thing, a few loaves and a few fish, and he creates a feast for 5,000 people. God is in the business of using small things. Think about Moses' rod and how powerfully God worked through it. Think about David's sling and how powerfully God worked through it. God is in the business of taking little things like you and like me and accomplishing great things through them. We learn that from this lesson. It also shows the blessing that comes from serving. The blessing that comes from serving. The disciples obeyed, as I just said, and blessing followed. If you obey, blessings will follow. So God blesses those who serve. God blesses those who serve him. I don't think we could have a better example of that than Amanda, who spoke with us today. God's blessings and God's joy just emanates from her life because she's obeying. She's doing what God has for her. We receive more when we obey, when we serve, than we give. I've learned that time and time again. We receive more than we give. And then finally, it reveals Christ's sufficiency. What Christ's miracle was enough. He supplied more than enough. But here's the thing. He is enough for us. He is all we need. Christ is enough. So, did anybody here know how many stories are there of feeding of a large group of people in the Gospels? There are two. This is one of them. Feeding of 5,000 men, more, if you add the women and children. I don't know why they just count the men. That's the way they did it back then. Whatever. Better not do that today. You'll get yourself in trouble. And then there's another one that's recorded in two Gospels that is feeding of 4,000. So we're going to compare those two a little bit, and I'm going to show you a picture. So this is two pictures of the two mosaics in two churches. The one on the left is on the northwestern side, I believe, of the Sea of Galilee. The one on the right is on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. That one on the left, that would have been Jewish territory. The one on the right would have been Gentile territory. These may be depicting the two feedings. We don't know for sure. We'll talk more about these mosaics in a little bit. So here's some differences between the two feedings. In the feeding of the 5,000, they fed 5,000 people, and that is recorded in all four Gospels. Remember, I told you it's the only miracle in John that is recorded in all four Gospels. So 5,000 people in the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000 people in the feeding of the 4,000. Wow, that's shocking. And Matthew and Mark both record the feeding of the 4,000. Now, there's some scholars who say, oh, it's the same feeding, they just got it mixed up. Well, then they recorded it twice, and in fact, Matthew would have recorded it in Matthew 14 and Matthew 15. So apparently he was senile if they were the same one, right? So I don't think it is. I think there were two feedings, and there are enough differences that they can't be the same feeding. And I'm about to go through some of those differences with you, not just the difference of 1,000 people. There was a difference in the number of fish and loaves. In the feeding of the 5,000, it was 2 fish and 5 loaves. In the feeding of the 4,000, it was a few fish, not numbered, and 7 loaves. And then there were different kinds of baskets. This basket on the left is a kophanos. It was called a kophanos. It was a large basket with no handle. It was like a family basket, and it was large. The basket on the right is called a spurus, and it was a small basket with a handle. It was like a lunch basket kind of thing. And so we see a difference between the two. By the way, all 4 Gospels say that it was a kophanos. Use that exact same word. And both Matthew and Mark use spurus. They use that word. That's another clue that they are 2 different feedings, and that because they each use the same term for the basket. The kophanos was oh, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. Okay, I got backwards. The kophanos was the small basket. And it was used exclusively by the Jews. It was a basket that the Jews used. So that was kind of a lunch basket. The spurus was a large basket with a handle, and it was used exclusively by the Gentile population. And if you go to Israel today, you can see these mosaics. And when you go with me, or when I go, I'll see them. Maybe there's a lot to see. The one on the left is a mosaic on the floor of a church near Tegava, and that's on the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee, which is kind of where the feeding likely took place. The one on the right is actually on the eastern side, on a church on the eastern side in Kursi, and it depicts the Gentile basket. Some scholars think that maybe the feeding of the 4,000 took place in Gentile territory, but we can't know that for sure. But maybe it was near Kursi. Then there was also a different number of baskets remaining, 12 baskets of leftovers in the feeding of the 5,000, and 7 baskets, meaning in the feeding of the 4,000. Some people put a great deal of emphasis on how many baskets there were, and this might be true. They say that the 12 baskets represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and this was a Jewish group of people, and that the number 7 is the number of perfection, or the number of completion, and God, intended to offer salvation to all people, including the Gentiles. So maybe it has something to do with the completion of his salvation for the Gentiles, but we can't know that for sure. They could just be numbers too. But we do know that that if the 7 means sufficiency, it's also referring to the sufficiency of Christ, if that's true. So that's the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Now let's talk about the miracle of walking on the water, which happens just after this. We're going to read this whole thing and then go back through it a little bit. When the people saw the sign that he had done, meaning feeding the 5,000, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." The prophet was one of the people they were looking for. Not sure if they meant Messiah or if they meant Elijah who was to come back. But they say this guy is from God, at very least. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. We learn in Mark that he sent his disciples to the boat. He said, "Get in the boat, I'll meet you on the other side." So when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So they're waiting for Jesus to come to them. And then it says, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." They were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. That may be another miracle. They might have immediately landed there, or it may just be that they got there quickly because they were no longer trying to row against the wind. So the first part of this, we're going to find out how Jesus responded to this miracle. And it says this in chapter 14. It says, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." So the people respond by saying, this guy's something special. And then it says, how Jesus responded was, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So Jesus got out of there. How he did, we're not sure, but he went to a place where he could be alone. Why did he run from these people? Grace? Why did he run?
Because he didn't want, it wasn't like his time to be glorified, and that wasn't how he was to be made king.
Yep, he didn't come to be that kind of king. He came to be a different kind of king. And it wasn't time for that to happen yet. So he got out of there. He knew that they wanted to make him king for the wrong reasons. They wanted a king that would overthrow Caesar. And their thinking was, this dude just multiplied food. Surely he can overthrow Caesar. Let's make him king. But they didn't see him as Messiah, or they would have worshipped him. And so Jesus needed to get out of there because he couldn't allow that to happen. So in the meantime, the disciples are in trouble. And it says this. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea at Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. So the disciples are in trouble. They begin to row toward Capernaum, and in a matter of minutes, the sea is churning, and there is a storm on the sea that is causing them to be afraid. Now remember, most of them are fishermen. So if they are on a boat, and they've been on the Sea of Galilee many times, if they are on a boat, because remember that that Peter and Philip and Andrew and someone whose name I can't remember grew up near the Sea of Galilee, grew up on the Sea of Galilee. And if they're afraid, it must be a really bad storm. And this is still true today, in fact, that storms come up quickly on the Sea of Galilee, particularly the northern side. Here's why. This is Capernaum. The book is saying they came from the east to the west. That's possible. We know the winds were coming from the west because you see that dot on the other side there is on that other side this gorge, this rift, and the winds blow through there and create great storms. It's called Arabelle. These two cliffs are called Arabelle, and the valley that they create between them. And the winds come through there and beat on the Sea of Galilee and create this moving wind creates the winds. And so they are going headlong into these winds if they're coming from the east. So they are in trouble and they're afraid. And Jesus appears walking on the water to them, and he saves the day. It says this: when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. When we read this same story in Mark says this, that the Lord came walking on the water and he was about to pass them by. When he saw that they were terrified, and he said, "It is I, do not be afraid." That's a paraphrase. And that gives a picture of this, of Jesus walking on the water. And he's about to walk past them, like he's showing off, right? So, look at me, I'm walking on the water, and then he sees they're afraid, and he stops and he goes, oh no, don't be afraid, I'm here. That's not what's happening. That's not what's happening here. That word for pass by is used in a number of times in the Old Testament. And in the Septuagint, it's the Greek Old Testament. And it is used everywhere that God reveals something of himself. One story is of Moses, who says, "Show me your glory." And God says, "No, we can't do that. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put you in this cleft of the rock, and I will pass by. My glory will pass by you." That same word is the same word used here, used in all 4 Gospels for this event. There's another story of Elijah, and God is going to speak to him, and he's not in the wind, and he's not in the rain. And then a still small voice comes, and God's presence passes by him. Same one. And there are a number of other places. Everywhere where that word is used, God is revealing something of himself. He's revealing himself to be glorious. He's revealing himself to be sufficient. He's revealing himself to be God. That's what Jesus is doing here. And when Jesus says, "It is I," the literal word for that is I am. He says, "Don't be afraid. I am. Don't be afraid. Yahweh." And I've already taught you about that word. So here's what's going on here. Jesus is walking on the water, and he intends to show them something of who he is. By the way, Job says only God treads on the water. Only God walks on water. These were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So John is telling us this so we can see, look, Jesus walking on the water is proof that he is God. And then Jesus tells them as much. He's about to reveal something of himself to them, but they are afraid. He's about to reveal that he is God by walking on the water, but they are afraid. And so he says, "Don't be afraid. I am God. I am Yahweh. I am God. Don't be afraid." And so he is revealing himself to be God, and he is telling them they don't need to be afraid because he is enough. He is God. He is sufficient. He is all that they need. And that, students, is true for us too. God is all we need. He is enough. So here's your lesson, your takeaway for this lesson is this: trust God and obey his every command. He knows what he is doing. Even when we think he doesn't, knows what he is doing. So that's it for chapter 15. That's it for the content, other than the quiz you're about to take, for the semester. I'm going to hand out the quiz. You may work on it together. You may use your book. However, you don't need to finish it today. I will give